In 1973, a billionaire sat in his English manor while his grandson's severed ear was delivered in the mail. J. Paul Getty was the richest man in the world. He had enough money to buy entire nations. Yet, when kidnappers demanded $17 million for the life of his flesh and blood, he didn't reach for his checkbook. He reached for a calculator. This J. Paul Getty story is the ultimate billionaire greed documentary, centered on the infamous Getty ransom refusal that shocked the globe. The John Paul Getty III kidnapping wasn't just a crime, it was a mathematical equation. While the public saw a family in crisis, the patriarch saw a tax-deductible liability. He famously argued that paying a single cent would put his other 14 grandchildren at risk, as he had 15 in total. But the truth was far colder. He approached the ransom as a business negotiation, calculating the maximum amount that would be tax-deductible and lending the remainder to his son at 4% interest. This is the dark history of the man who loved oil more than his own DNA. The Getty fortune did not begin with a stroke of luck. It began with a cold, calculated bet on the dirt of Oklahoma. George Getty, the patriarch, started with a $500 investment for mineral rights in the year 1903. He was a man of the law, a man of sobriety, and a man who believed that wealth was a sign of divine favor. By the time his son, John Paul, took the reins, the family was already wealthy. But Paul did not want mere wealth. He wanted a monopoly. He wanted the kind of power that could bend the trajectory of history. He was a man who spoke several languages fluently, including French, German, and Italian, and could read Arabic. But he rarely used them to express affection or empathy. To Paul, language was just another tool for negotiation. He saw the world not as a collection of people, but as a giant balance sheet, where every asset had to be squeezed for maximum yield. During the Great Depression, while the rest of America starved and families stood in bread lines, Getty went on a predatory shopping spree. He didn't feel pity for the fallen, he felt hunger. He watched as the titans of the previous century crumbled under the weight of the 1929 crash. Getty didn't retreat, he attacked. He began buying oil stocks for pennies on the dollar, targeting companies like Tidewater Petroleum and Skelly Oil. He wasn't building a business in the traditional sense. He was cannibalizing a collapsing economy. He lived by a singular, brutal mantra. He lived by the contrarian principle that the time to buy is when others are selling in a panic, even if that blood belonged to his competitors or his friends. He spent the 1930s hiding in cheap hotel rooms, obsessed with the ticker tape, slowly weaving a web of holding companies that would eventually become an untouchable fortress. His relationship with his father was the blueprint for his own coldness. George Getty never truly trusted his son. He saw Paul as a profligate, a man whose 5 marriages and endless string of mistresses were a stain on the family name. When George died in 1930, he left his son a relatively small inheritance of $500,000 from a $10 million estate, leaving the controlling interest to his widow, Sarah. The rest went to Paul's mother. It was a deliberate insult from the grave. But Paul didn't mourn. He didn't reflect. He used that rejection as fuel to prove that he could become more powerful than the man who sired him. He spent the next 2 decades outmaneuvering his own mother to gain control of the family trust. He treated his inheritance like a hostile takeover. By the time he was finished, he had transformed a successful mid-sized oil company into a global titan that controlled every aspect of production, from the drill bit to the gas pump. He was the first of his kind, a nomad of capital who felt no loyalty to any flag or any person. He moved through the world like a ghost, residing in luxury hotels and rented villas, never putting down roots, always looking for the next extraction point. He believed that emotions were a luxury for the poor and that sentimentality was the fastest way to the poorhouse. He was a man who owned the earth's crust, but he was already beginning to lose his soul to the very black gold he pulled from the ground. This wasn't just business. It was a crusade for total dominance that would eventually require a human sacrifice. But before he could face the kidnappers in Rome, he had to conquer the most unforgiving desert on the planet. By the 1950s, John Paul Getty was no longer just a wealthy businessman. He was a ghost in the machine of global commerce. He was officially crowned the richest man on the entire planet, but he didn't reach the summit by playing fair. He reached it by seeing value where every other titan of industry saw a graveyard. While his competitors were fighting over the scraps of established American oil fields, Getty turned his gaze toward the Middle East, specifically a desolate, blistering patch of sand known as the Neutral Zone. It was a 60-mile strip of land between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Geologists called it a dry hole. The major oil companies called it a money pit. Getty called it an opportunity. In 1949, he made his move. He didn't just bid, he gambled with the intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose, despite having everything already. He paid King Saud $9.5 million in cash up front. On top of that, he agreed to a royalty of 55 cents per barrel. This was unheard of. In the industry, it was seen as financial suicide. For 4 long, agonizing years, Getty poured millions more into that patch of dirt. He built roads, he built piers, he built a city in the middle of nowhere, and for 4 years, he found nothing. His investors panicked. His peers laughed. They thought the smartest man in the room had finally lost his mind to the desert heat. Then, in 1953, the earth finally screamed. Getty hit the Wafra field. It wasn't just a discovery, it was a geyser of black gold that would eventually produce 16 million barrels of oil every single year. This single gamble didn't just increase his net worth, it shattered the scale. By 1957, Fortune magazine declared him the richest living American. He had bypassed the Rockefellers. He had outmaneuvered the Mellons. But as his bank account grew to astronomical proportions, his soul seemed to shrink. The billionaire's obsession with the bottom line began to mutate into something clinical, something terrifying. He moved his base of operations to England, purchasing Sutton Place, a 72-room Tudor estate. It was a palace fit for a king, but Getty ran it like a high-security prison for his own wealth. This was the era of the legendary payphone. Getty noticed that his staff and guests were using his private landlines to make long-distance calls. To most men worth $1 billion, a few dollars in phone charges is a rounding error. To Getty, it was grand larceny. He had a public payphone installed in the hallway of one of the most expensive homes in the world. He didn't care about the optics. He didn't care about the embarrassment of his guests. He cared about the pennies. He was a man who owned the Earth's crust, but refused to subsidize a 3-minute conversation. This wasn't just frugality. It was a manifestation of his core philosophy. Every cent not working for him was an enemy. He began to apply this same cold, mathematical logic to his human relationships. He saw his employees not as people, but as overhead. He saw his business rivals not as competitors, but as inefficiencies to be liquidated. He built a vertical monopoly where he owned the wells, the tankers, the refineries, and the gas stations. If you drove a car in the 1960s, chances are you were paying a tax to John Paul Getty. He had achieved the ultimate capitalist dream. He was the house, and the house always won. But the higher the empire rose, the more isolated the emperor became. He surrounded himself with a rotating cast of 5 wives and countless mistresses, yet he trusted none of them. He believed that every woman was a gold digger and every friend was a parasite. He spent his nights alone in his massive study, surrounded by a secret ledger that tracked every single expense down to the cost of a single postage stamp. He was obsessed with the idea of a, quote, zero for everything. He believed that every object, every company, and every person had a fixed price point. If the price went above that point, he walked away. If it fell below, he pounced. He was a machine designed to accumulate, but he had forgotten how to distribute. The world looked at Sutton Place and saw a golden fortress. They saw a man who had conquered the most volatile industry on earth through sheer willpower and cold calculation. They saw a genius of the Gilded Age reborn in the 20th century. But inside those thick stone walls, the foundation was already starting to crack. Getty had built a world where money was the only language spoken, and he was about to find out what happens when that language is used against your own blood. The monopoly was complete, but the cost of maintaining it was about to become personal. To the outside world, John Paul Getty was more than a man. He was a sovereign state. He resided in Sutton Place, a 72-room Tudor estate in the English countryside that served as his fortress of solitude. He didn't just live there, he occupied it. This was a man who surrounded himself with the ghosts of kings, filling his halls with Renaissance masterpieces and Roman antiquities that he acquired with the same surgical precision he used to strip oil from the earth. He treated art like a commodity. A painting wasn't a window into the soul, it was a hedge against inflation. A statue wasn't a work of beauty, it was a depreciating asset that needed to be leveraged. He would spend hours calculating the exact humidity levels required to preserve a canvas, not out of love for the brushstrokes, but because a crack in the oil meant a drop in the resale value. His personal life was a revolving door of contracts and legal fine print. Getty was married and divorced 5 times. To him, a wife was a temporary merger, a short-term acquisition. He viewed the emotional needs of a partner as an unnecessary overhead cost. He famously remarked that a lasting relationship with a woman was only possible if a man was a failure. Since Getty was the ultimate success, he considered himself genetically incapable of domestic peace. He treated his wives like outdated machinery. When the maintenance costs grew too high or the novelty wore off, he initiated a liquidation. He didn't want a companion. He wanted an audience that didn't talk back. This mechanical approach to human connection extended to his children. He didn't see sons. He saw extensions of his brand. He saw potential heirs who had to be stress-tested until they broke. He pushed them to the brink, withholding affection to build, quote, one, which in Getty's vocabulary was just another word for ruthlessness. He ignored their birthdays, but tracked their expenses to the cent. He expected them to be titans like him, yet he refused to give them the capital or the autonomy to actually build anything. He wanted them to be shadows in his garden. He wanted them to be grateful for the privilege of carrying his name while he made them beg for a seat at his table. The billionaire's paranoia was legendary. He was the richest man on the planet, yet he was terrified that the world was trying to nickel and dime him to death. This was the man who installed a dial-lock payphone in the hallway of his mansion. He was tired of his house guests and domestic staff using his private line to make long-distance calls on his dime. Think about the scale of that pettiness. A man who controlled the flow of global energy, a man whose net worth could fluctuate by millions in a single afternoon based on the price of a barrel of crude, was worried about the cost of a 3-minute telephone call. He would invite the elite of British society to his home, feed them on silver platters, and then point them toward a payphone if they needed to call a taxi. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle of the transaction. In Getty's world, nothing was free, not even a conversation. He lived in a golden cage of his own design. He rarely traveled by air, terrified of crashes, preferring the slow, controlled movement of ocean liners or his own fleet of cars. He was a man who owned the world, but was afraid to move through it. He surrounded himself with security guards and Alsatian dogs, convinced that every person he met was a parasite looking for a handout. He became a hermit in a tuxedo. He would sit in his study, surrounded by the greatest treasures of Western civilization, and eat a simple meal alone, obsessing over ledger sheets. He had achieved the ultimate dream of the capitalist: total accumulation. But the cost of that accumulation was a total isolation that no amount of oil could lubricate. His children were the first to pay the price for this environment. They were raised in the shadow of a mountain that didn't care if they lived or died, as long as the mountain kept growing. They were the first casualties of the Getty formula. The wealth was a poison that seeped into their veins, paralyzing their ambition and destroying their sense of self. They were the heirs to a fortune they weren't allowed to touch, and the sons of a father who didn't know how to love. The gilded life was a facade. Behind the marble statues and the manicured gardens, the foundation of the Getty Empire was beginning to crack under the pressure of a man who valued the price of a phone call more than the sanity of his own blood. The world saw a king, but the family saw a cold, calculating machine that was about to be tested by a tragedy that no amount of money could fix. But while the billionaire sat in his fortress, counting his coins and ignoring his children, a darker storm was gathering in the streets of Rome. The Getty name was no longer just a symbol of wealth. It had become a target, and the man who refused to pay for a phone call was about to be asked for a price that would force him to choose between his ledger and his soul. The cracks were no longer just in the family. They were in the very walls of the empire itself. The empire began to bleed from the inside. For J. Paul Getty, a family was not a source of comfort. It was a poorly managed subsidiary. He treated his sons like middle managers who were constantly failing their performance reviews. The pressure was suffocating. The Getty name was synonymous with gold, but the family reality was a landscape of leaden despair. His eldest son, George Getty, was the chosen successor. He worked 18-hour days trying to earn a single word of praise that never came. In 1973, the tension snapped. George died under mysterious circumstances involving a cocktail of drugs and alcohol. The official report was a tragic end, but the underlying cause was clear. He had been crushed by the weight of a father who valued the price of a barrel of crude more than the life of his own heir. The patriarch didn't attend the funeral. He was too busy. He was too insulated. He was too cold. With the heir apparent gone, the Getty dynasty began to fracture into a dozen different directions. Another son became a total recluse, hiding from the world in a desperate attempt to escape the shadow of the old man's ledger. The family was wealthy beyond imagination, yet they were spiritually bankrupt. They lived in palaces, but felt like prisoners. This was the paradox of the Getty fortune. The more money Paul accumulated, the less safety his family felt. He had created a world where everyone was a potential predator, and every relationship was a liability. He didn't just hoard money, he weaponized it against his own flesh and blood. Then came the ultimate test of his philosophy. In July 1973, the empire moved from internal rot to external violence. His grandson, John Paul Getty III, was a 16-year-old living a bohemian life in Rome. He was known as the Golden Hippie. To the Italian underworld, he was a walking lottery ticket. On a humid summer night, he was snatched off the streets by the Ndrangheta, a brutal crime syndicate. They didn't see a boy. They saw $17 million. The kidnappers sent a ransom note. They expected a quick payout. After all, the grandfather was the richest man in human history. To Paul Getty, $17 million was a rounding error. It was less than he spent on a single Greek statue. But when the boy's mother, Gail, begged the billionaire for help, she didn't find a grieving grandfather. She found a stone wall. Getty looked at the situation through the lens of a hostile takeover. He didn't see a kidnapping. He saw a bad deal. He famously told the press that he had 14 other grandchildren, and if he paid 1 penny now, he would have 14 kidnapped grandchildren tomorrow. It sounded like logic. It sounded like a principled stand against terrorism. But those close to him knew better. It wasn't about the safety of the others, it was about the math. He was calculating the depreciation of his own grandson's value in real time. For months, the billionaire sat in his 72-room manor in England, surrounded by security guards and Alsatian dogs, while his grandson was chained in a freezing cave in the Italian mountains. The boy was being starved, he was being beaten, he was being broken. While the world watched in horror, Getty continued to analyze oil futures and buy up Renaissance art. He was a man who owned the Earth's crust, but refused to pay for the life of his namesake. Gail, the boy's mother, was frantic. She had no money of her own. Getty had made sure of that. He kept his family on a strict allowance, ensuring they remained dependent and powerless. She was trapped between the brutality of the kidnappers and the chilling indifference of the billionaire. The kidnappers grew frustrated. They didn't understand that they were dealing with a man who felt no empathy, only the cold thrill of a negotiation. They realized that the Getty name was famous for wealth, but the man behind it was famous for a greed that bordered on the pathological. The stalemate lasted for 5 agonizing months. The kidnappers realized that a ransom note wouldn't work on a man with a heart made of flint. They needed to send a message that couldn't be ignored by the tabloids or the accountants. They decided to provide a physical manifestation of their demands. They decided to prove that while Getty valued his money, they valued nothing at all. The foundation of the empire wasn't just cracking, it was about to be shattered by a single blood-stained envelope. For 5 months, 17-year-old John Paul Getty III lived in a hole in the ground. He was chained to a stake in the Calabrian mountains. He was surrounded by filth, freezing temperatures, and men who saw him as nothing more than a winning lottery ticket. Back in London, his grandfather was busy. He was busy looking at a small, leather-bound ledger. This was the secret heart of the Getty Empire. It contained a mathematical formula that calculated the precise value of a human life based on tax liability and interest rates. To J. Paul Getty, the boy in the cave wasn't a grandson. He was a depreciating asset in a hostile negotiation. The kidnappers initially demanded $17 million. It was a sum Getty could have paid by selling a single painting from his hallway. Instead, he called a press conference. He stood before the world's cameras with a face like carved granite. He told the world that he had 14 other grandchildren. He argued that if he paid a single penny, he would be painting a target on the backs of every one of them. It sounded like the logic of a patriarch protecting his brood. It was actually the tactic of a corporate raider waiting for the market to bottom out. He was waiting for the price of his grandson's life to drop. By November, the kidnappers lost their patience. They took a razor to the boy's head. They sliced off his right ear. They mailed the rotted piece of flesh to a Roman newspaper. It took 3 weeks to arrive because of a postal strike. When the package finally opened, the world gasped. Getty did not. He looked at the photographs of his mutilated flesh and blood and saw a bargaining chip. The ear was proof of a failing product. The kidnappers were desperate. In the cold world of J. Paul Getty, desperation meant the price was about to fall. He finally entered the negotiation, but he didn't send a family member. He sent a former CIA agent with instructions to treat the kidnappers like a rival oil company. The $17 million demand was crushed. Getty whittled them down to $3 million. Then he looked at the $3 million and shook his head. He went back to his secret ledger. He consulted his accountants. He discovered that under United States tax law, the maximum tax-deductible gift was $2,200,000. This is where the billionaire's greed crossed into the realm of the sociopathic. He agreed to pay the $2.2 million because it cost him nothing in the eyes of the Internal Revenue Service. But there was still a gap of $800,000. The kidnappers wouldn't go lower. The boy's father, a man struggling with addiction and living in the shadow of a giant, begged for the difference. Getty agreed to provide the remaining money, but not as a gift. He issued a formal loan. He made his own son sign a legal contract to repay the $800,000 at a 4% annual interest rate. J. Paul Getty had successfully turned his grandson's kidnapping into a structured investment vehicle. He was literally profiting from the mutilation of his own bloodline. The money was dropped on a lonely stretch of highway. The boy was released in a snowstorm. He flagged down a truck, his head wrapped in bloody bandages, a ghost of the vibrant teenager who had been snatched months earlier. He called his grandfather to thank him for saving his life. Getty refused to take the call. He was busy. There was more oil to pump, more stocks to short, and a ledger that finally balanced. The boy never recovered. The trauma led to a spiral of drug use. By 1981, a massive overdose triggered a stroke that left him nearly blind and paralyzed for the rest of his life. He spent 3 decades in a wheelchair, a living monument to his grandfather's frozen heart. The open loop of the Getty formula was finally revealed to the world. It wasn't about protecting the other grandchildren. It was about the absolute refusal to let any event, no matter how tragic, result in a net loss on a balance sheet. To J. Paul Getty, the only thing more sacred than oil was the principle of the transaction. He had won the negotiation, but in doing so, he had effectively liquidated the soul of his family. The empire was intact, the cash stayed in the bank, and the interest on the ransom loan continued to accrue. But as the billionaire sat alone in his 72-room mansion, the silence began to sound like a funeral. The Getty name was now etched in gold, but the foundation was rotting from a poison that money couldn't cure. Even as he reached the end of his life, Getty wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking for a way to ensure that even in death, his wealth would remain under his absolute control, far away from the hands of the children he had spent a lifetime breaking. The death of John Paul Getty in 1976 was not a moment of national mourning. It was a cold, administrative closing of a ledger. He died at Sutton Place, surrounded by his security guards and his barking dogs, but notably absent of any warmth. He had spent his final years as a prisoner of his own paranoia, convinced that every human interaction was a disguised attempt to siphon off his capital. When the news of his passing broke, the world didn't ask how he died. They asked who got the money. The answer would shock his family and serve as his final, most calculated insult to his own bloodline. The bulk of the Getty fortune did not go to his children or the grandchildren he had treated as liabilities. Instead, he left the staggering sum of $1.2 billion to the Getty Trust. His goal was simple and narcissistic. He wanted to build the most expensive museum in human history. He wanted his name carved into marble that would outlast his DNA. He realized that children could fail, they could use drugs, and they could embarrass the brand. But a Roman statue? A Renaissance painting? Those assets remained silent. They never asked for a raise. They never needed a ransom. The legal battle that followed was a feast for vultures. His surviving sons and ex-wives fought over the remaining scraps of his estate for years. It was a multi-decade war, played out in wood-paneled courtrooms, proving Getty's own theory that money was the only thing that truly bound people together. While the family tore itself apart, the Getty Oil Company became a target. Without the iron fist of the patriarch to protect it, the empire was vulnerable. In 1984, the corporate world witnessed what was then the largest merger in history. Texaco bought Getty Oil for $10.1 billion. The company John Paul had built by buying stocks for pennies during the Great Depression was swallowed whole by a rival. The monopoly was dead. But the most tragic part of the Getty autopsy isn't the lost oil fields or the corporate takeovers. It is the human wreckage left in the wake of his greed. John Paul Getty III, the boy whose ear was sold for a tax deduction, never recovered. He spent the rest of his life haunted by the 5 months he spent in a hole in the ground, knowing his grandfather valued a tax write-off more than his life. He eventually succumbed to a drug-induced stroke that left him nearly blind and paralyzed for the rest of his days. He was a living ghost of a fortune that refused to save him. The Getty Trust today is one of the wealthiest cultural institutions on the planet. Its endowment has grown to over $7 billion. It spends hundreds of millions every year on art, conservation, and research. It is a place of immense beauty and scholarly prestige. But every stone in that museum was paid for by a man who installed a payphone for his house guests. Every masterpiece on the wall is a reminder of a grandfather who charged his own son 4% interest to save his grandson's life. John Paul Getty proved that you can indeed take it with you, just not in the way people think. He took his coldness and his calculations and turned them into a monument that will stand for centuries. He transformed his liquid wealth into solid stone, ensuring that the world would remember his name while forgetting the faces of the children he neglected. He was the ultimate practitioner of financial Darwinism. He didn't just survive the markets, he outlived his own humanity. When we look at the Getty legacy, we see the ultimate paradox of the billionaire class. We see a man who owned the rights to the Earth's most valuable resource, but lived in a state of self-imposed poverty of the soul. He was a king who lived like a beggar, terrified of a long-distance phone bill. His life was a masterclass in accumulation and a failure in distribution. He died as the richest man in the world, but he was buried with the realization that gold is a very cold blanket. Money is a tool, but for J. Paul Getty, it was a weapon used against his own family. He died as he lived, surrounded by the world's most expensive objects and the world's deepest silence. He proved that you can own the world and still have nothing to leave behind but a cautionary tale. The Getty formula was perfect on paper, but it was fatal in practice. It showed that the true cost of an empire isn't measured in billions of dollars, but in the silence of a family that no longer speaks. If you want to understand the true cost of the world's darkest fortunes, stay tuned. Subscribe to keep tracking the shadows.